All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started. I'm sure some more folks will start joining us or will join us as I go through this introduction. But my name is Justice. I am the project and administrative assistant for the Sustainability Council and the primary coordinator for our speaker series. And we also have Hussein on the call today, who is also with our team at the Sustainability Council. You'll probably see him in the chat, just providing some directions and links. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We're tremendously excited to have Dr. Ashlee Cunsolo here. Before we start, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So the University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and Métis Nation Zone 4, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. I also think it would be in keeping with the spirit of providing a land acknowledgement and the topic of our talk today for all of us to just take a brief moment, even as I'm speaking, just to think about where we are and where we live, wherever we are or wherever that is in the world. And I think we actually have people calling from joining the call today from around the world. Perhaps right now most of us are sitting at a computer with the whole world sort of in digital form at our fingertips, which at least for me can end up being a very atomizing experience, actually. Wherever we are, we're embedded in multiple levels of social and ecological systems, from our dwelling and the infrastructure, the city and the town around us, to these systems being nested within a larger ecological system, the ecosystem, the drainage basin, the atmosphere. We're never meaningfully separated from the world around us, even if it feels like that, especially living in a big city. So as I go through the remainder of the introduction, I would encourage you all to take a moment to really ground yourself in where you are right now. Now, this talk today is part of the Sustainability Council lecture series. During the academic year, the Council hosts interdisciplinary scholars, professionals, and activists who engage with sustainability, climate change, and the environment. The lectures are usually held bi-weekly through the academic year, although we're really reaching the end of the semester. So from today's events on through June, we're moving to a once-a-month schedule. So we will have today's event and then one event in May and one event in June around Environment Day. And you can find more information on our website at uab.ca/sustain, which I'll put in the chat just after this. So just a few more notes before we begin. Firstly, as Hussein had mentioned, we will be recording today's lecture and posting it at our YouTube channel at UAlberta Sustainability. Again, that'll be in the chat. For everyone here today, no need to worry about being recorded. The video will only capture my screen and then Ashlee's screen as well. The audience will not appear in the published video. There will be a Q&A to follow the talk. So if you have any questions that come up during the talk, please put them in the Zoom chat. We'll gather them from there, and then I'll pose them to Ashlee to follow her talk. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. So Dr. Ashlee Cunsolo is the founding dean of the School of Arctic and Subarctic Studies and the Labrador and at the Labrador campus of Memorial University. And she's also a former Canada Research Chair and a Member Emeritus of the Royal Society of Canada College of New Artists, Scholars, and Scientists. She's a leading voice internationally on climate change, mental health, and ecological grief, and a regular contributor to media and policy, as well as the editor of Mourning Nature, Hope at the Heart of Ecological Grief and Loss. And we're very honored to have you here today, Ashlee. So I'll pass it over to you without further ado.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Justice, for that really kind introduction and for the thought and the care that you put into the land acknowledgement as well. I really appreciate that. And I'm actually calling in today as an invited and uninvited guest at the same time on the homelands of the Innu and Inuit, both ancestral and continued. And I take that really seriously in the work that I do, both as a researcher and in academic administration. And I appreciated you linking us all within embedded systems of humans and more than humans, because that's really what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm a settler. I'm second generation Italian on my dad's side and have over a 350-year colonizing history on my mother's side. That's Irish and English, and in Nova Scotia on Unama'ki in the homelands of the Mi'kmaq. And so I grew up on the unceded territories of the Anishinaabe Nation in Guelph, Ontario. And I've lived in many provinces and territories in Labrador, and I'm now calling Happy Valley Goose Bay my home. And this is a place that I have been having the great pleasure of working in for over 14 years. And much of that work actually has been done with Dr. Sherry Lee Harper, who I'm sure is no stranger to many on this call, but she's a Canada Research Chair in Climate Change and Health at the University of Alberta and the School of Public Health. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today is actually work that Sherry and I conducted in partnership with Inuit in the Nunatsiavut region of Labrador. But before I get into talking about it, I really want to make sure that we have enough time at the end for questions and for discussion and for sharing experiences. I find when I do these talks and we talk about ecological grief and we talk about planetary sorrow and we talk about the heavy emotions that we carry in the work that many, many of us do, it's really important to make space to have those discussions and be able to talk and share. So I'm really looking forward to that piece. And I really appreciate the invite to be part of such an important speaker series as what you're doing, Justice, with your team. And I also really appreciate your time in being here, especially at the end of a semester. I know there's many competing interests, so the fact that we're joined here together to talk about ecological emotions and grief and loss and what we can do together is really important. So this work really began in this place here. This is Rigolette, Nunatsiavut. It's on the northeast coast of Labrador. So, if you look at that map there, just midway up the north coast, it's a part of the Nunatsiavut land claim settlement region. So there are 5 Inuit communities, and Rigolette is the southernmost community. And so I initially started working with Rigolette back in 2008. It was actually through Dr. Sherry Lee Harper, who was conducting research with the community that they had identified as important around the ways in which climate change was impacting water quality and their health. And Rigolette has been at the front lines of climate change for decades. Labrador as a whole is one of the fastest warming places anywhere in Canada and in the world. So what has been happening here is things that are projected for other parts of the country and other parts of the north. And already Labrador has seen an increase in average temperature changes of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, which is quite profound when you're in a place that really relies on, cold and snow and ice. And there's been substantial changes to things like weather patterns, to animal and plant migration, to the different ways that people are able to interact with the land. So based on what people were experiencing, they were looking to have a large-scale project that examined the diverse ways that climate change was impacting Inuit health and well-being. And so myself and Sherry worked with the community and worked with a variety of Inuit interviewers to really define what was important to people, how did they want the research to be done, what would it look like, and what are the key questions that people were experiencing. So after 2 years of working with the community and having interviews conducted by both ourselves and Inuit researchers and talking to people, I think the youngest was 9 and the oldest was over 80. We talked to over 80 people in the community. And what was really amazing was no matter the age or the gender or background or occupation or time spent on the land, the biggest concerns that people were discussing was around mental and emotional health and well-being. And at that time, back in 2009, there was virtually no literature on this. So we were experiencing and talking to people about their lived experiences, and there was very little discussion about this happening nationally or internationally. So what we learned from people in Rigolette really started to shape and define how we began to understand the ways in which climate change was impacting mental health. So some of the things that people discussed was to really make sure, there we go. Oh, sorry, there's a little glitch on my end. I will just take it back. Was to really understand that for people in Nunatsiavut, the land was the most important thing, and connections to the land was foundational and fundamental to all aspects of health and well-being. And so people talked about, the land being family, being kin, being foundational to who they were, to how they understood the world, and most importantly, to what it meant to be Inuit. And so for people in Nunatsiavut, part of this is the cold, the ice, the snow, and having stable environmental conditions where you can hunt, you can trap, you can travel on the land, and you know how to be in the environment, and you have that embedded place. And exactly what Justice was talking about at the beginning, that people see themselves as part of this larger fabric and embedded in these socio-cultural environmental relationships. And I really love this quote. This actually came from a documentary film that we made with all 5 communities on climate change and mental health, where one elder and hunter said, "For me, my government is my land." And I think, having that connection where land is health, is well-being, but it's also the governing strategies of how you exist in the world is an important piece to understand. So people also talked about that deep connection, feeling part of the land, being, feeling it's as much a part of your life as breathing. You see in this quote here, it's me, it's us, it's my people, having that sense of attachment. And then people would talk about without that connection, it felt like something fundamental was missing, that you had gone through a loss or that you didn't feel like yourself. And so when we're talking about mental health and emotional health, everyone that we talked to talked about the foundational way in which connecting to the land and being on the land or the water or the ice and being outside was absolutely foundational to mental health and wellness. And I think this quote really sums it up, that people like to go out on the land to feel good. And if they can't go out on the land, they just don't feel like people. So when we talk to people about the changes, and as I mentioned, Labrador is really at the front lines of climate change in Canada and in the north. People talked about the significant disruption to sea ice and the rising temperatures. So in previous times, ice would form sort of, end of October, mid-November, and then would go at the, end of April, mid-May, sometimes even end of May. Now what we're seeing is ice is forming end of December and January, and it's breaking up in April. So a significant shift in ice regime. Also a significant decrease. So the North Labrador Sea has lost about 70% of its sea ice, which is a shocking change. As I mentioned before, the 3 to 4 degree temperature change that's already been experienced here, increased winds, changes in snow, changes in animals, changes in plants. It's a fundamentally rapidly changing environment. And this quote here, really brings up that existential connection to what people are experiencing. And this was by Elder Tony Anderson up in Nain, which is the northernmost community. And this is how we ended the documentary film. And he said, Inuit are people of the sea ice. And if there's no more sea ice, how can we be people of the sea ice? So what people here are experiencing, and what many people around the world, is a fundamental existential shift to who you are, to who and what you're connected to, and what it means when you think about not only yourself, but your children, your grandchildren, and future generations. Sometimes there's a bit of a delay. So what we were talking to people about was really came to a point where, a lot of climate change research at the time was really working with people to document observations. So exactly what I was just talking about before around, what are you seeing? How's the environment change? How does that impact life? But very little was actually asking people, like, how does that make you feel? And it was actually people in the community who started to lead this research and talk about, not only are we seeing these things, but this is how it's impacting us. And a lot of people talked about a diverse range of psychological impacts. And so in particular, health professionals that we were working with talked about concern for increased addictions, increased depression, increased anxiety, when people are what people identified as stuck or trapped in the community. So if you can't travel safely out on the ice, or the ice isn't formed, or you're unable to do things like go hunting or go fishing or be with your family out on the land and do things that are important to you and important to your culture, people have what was identified as empty time. And sometimes in that empty time, and to deal with the complex emotions, not only around climate change, but also around all the painful history of intergenerational trauma, residential school, forced relocation, enduring colonial oppression, ongoing systemic barriers, all of these things combine, and climate change becomes both a direct and an indirect stressor to the other underlying mental health challenges. So when we're looking sort of, not only at rigolettes and in Nunatsiavut, but when we're looking globally, when we see now what we know about climate change and mental health at this time, we know there's multiple drivers. So there's the acute, where it's instantaneous things such as wildfires, flooding, major disasters, which have a very acute traumatic moment, and then often the months and years of ramifications of both rebuilding physically, but also that rebuilding of mental and emotional health and well-being. Then there's the slow and cumulative. So these are the pieces, often what we're seeing here in Labrador, where it's day to day, month to month, year by year, but there's no one break event. It's just an ongoing change. And people would talk about this as like change without end. Then there's the vicarious piece, or bearing witness piece. So when we see the pain that's happening to other people, when we experience through media or through knowing people or watching things on the news, that we can have our own mental and emotional impacts to that. We know there's disruptions to place attachment, where places that are beloved and important are disrupted through climate shifts and climate disasters. And then also disruptions to the social determinants of health. So the other underlying things that make us healthy and well, and that can support or prevent flourishing. So a lot of climate sensitive outcomes that we saw in Nunatsiavut and are also resonating all around the world are strong emotional reactions. So, anger, frustration, sadness, helplessness, hopelessness, and things like psychological outcomes. So there's a lot of research emerging around temperature associations with suicide and suicide ideation. We're seeing research linking particularly around heat waves and major natural disasters to increase addictions and family stress. We're seeing place-based loss and pain, erosion of cultural identity and connection, and ecological grief and loss. And this is something that I particularly focus on, and something that really emerged out of the research from Labrador. And then from that research, talking to more and more people around the world that were doing similar types of climate change and mental health research. And so I want to talk about ecological grief now as we move forward. And the piece that I'm going to talk about here is something I did in partnership with Dr. Neville Ellis in Australia. And so Neville at the time was working with Australian farmers in the wheat belt that were going through, almost a decade of extreme drought. And, our team in Labrador with Inuit and climate change, and his team with farmers in Australia, completely different geographies, completely different climate, different backgrounds and climate drivers. We got together and started sharing results. And what was really incredible was, there was almost no ability to tell the quotes and the experiences apart. So you could substitute drought with sea ice loss, and you wouldn't know who said what. And so that's when we started to work on different ways of understanding ecological grief to start a larger conversation around taking this seriously as a major component of climate change. So the first one is the obvious one, the grief that's associated with the physical and ecological loss and all the things that we've been talking about. So that grief that you have when you can actually see a tangible loss or erosion. But there's also extensive grief that people experience around disruptions to that place-based or environmental knowledge or impacts to identity. And so this is, anything ranging from cultural erosion to, feeling like you no longer recognize an environment that you're in. And this really resonates with Glenn Albrecht's concept of solastalgia, or the homesickness you feel while still at home because the environment around you has changed so much. And then there's also grief associated with anticipated or future losses, and that bearing witness to loss and seeing the pain of others. And this was something that really came up a lot in our research, but is also something that I have been noticing over the last several years is really one of the major points of conversation right now around ecological grief and anxiety is this anticipation of what's coming. So we know what we've lost to date. We know what the science is. We know what the projections are. We know what's coming. And so, we can anticipate continued loss and damage and trauma for both humans and more than humans. And this is becoming a major driver of negative mental health for many people. So this came from a paper that myself and Sherry Lee Harper and several other people worked on, where we're looking at this from a public health response and really understanding that ecological grief and anxiety are reasonable, rational responses. And this is something that I really emphasize because so many people in the research and the work that I do and the outreach and the talks are almost embarrassed that they feel grief and anxiety, or that they feel sadness or fear or frustration. And it's a completely reasonable response because we are watching wide scale global change. We're seeing suffering. As I said, we know the science, we know the projections, and so of course we're going to have these emotions. And I think what we're seeing is this population level emotional distress and anxiety really are increasing. And it's really essential that we start to take a holistic response that's really premised on health equity, to focus on individuals, communities, families, and really making sure that we're building resilient mental health systems that are, focus on understanding that while we are still dealing with climate change, and this is going to go on for decades, then people are going to be mentally and emotionally affected. So this idea that we need the ability to explore the emotions, we need the political will to make change, and we really need more funding and research to understand how we can support these unique forms of mental health stressors and what types of responses there can be to support flourishing and resilience. So really, for so long and so much of the climate change literature, it's really been focused on the future. For many people around the world, including here in Labrador, the future is now, and the future was decades ago. So not this past winter, but the previous winter that just went by, we set a whole amount of heat records here in Labrador, and it was another devastating winter and year. And that has carried forward and continues to carry forward with how people are when they think about what next year is going to be like, what previous years were, how they used to be, and where we're going now. And really what we're facing, we're living in this kind of time of enduring and ongoing loss and damage. And it's really characterized by strong emotions, and particularly by grief and loss. And I love this quote here around, to be creatures who love, we must be creatures who despair at what we lose. And so, there's a really important way of understanding grief. It can be painful. It can be completely isolating, but we don't need to carry the planetary sorrow that many of us have in isolation. And we don't need to see it as a negative thing. We can actually see it as a gift of grief and an opportunity to highlight who and what we value and what we're fighting for. And so, grief is the one side, and on the other side is love, because we only grieve what we love. We only grieve what we're connected to. We only grieve what we feel a sense of relational capacity and responsibility to. So there's really amazing work that mourning and grief can actually do. And Judith Butler has this wonderful way where she calls grief a we creating capacity, that it actually creates these communities and it can bring people together that really can create new ethical and political spaces. And, it can foster deeper relationships with other humans, with the more than humans, and with understanding, who we are in the world. And because of that, grief actually has the capacity for broad scale political mobilization, for sparking policy change, for changing personal and collective behavior. And so this is where I find some of the most inspiring work. And, people always ask me, where do you keep hope? You study really sad, depressing things. And I think many, many of us do. And I would imagine that many people who are drawn to this talk, are doing this important ecological work and doing the important emotional work as well. And I think, there's this gritty hope that comes from grief. So not a Pollyanna hope, but something that's earned, that understands that we have lost, we are losing, and we will continue to lose many things. But there are things that we can do together. And we can make that change, and we can come together if we attend to the grief work and the grief that we may be experiencing. So on that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions and to the questions and to anything that people may want to share about their own experiences. Or David, in the chat before it started, where you said you taught some of this work in courses, like I'd love to hear from the student experience of what people are going through.
Well, thanks very much, Ashlee. Yeah, just before we start, well, that was an amazing talk, and I'm also looking forward to this as well. Normally, what we do is handle the questions through text, but I'm wondering, would you prefer if we give people the opportunity to unmute themselves and actually share? We usually do it for the timing, but if people want to share their experiences, it would be easier for them to unmute themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
It's completely up to you, Justice. I'm good with both ways. Yeah.
Okay, then why don't we'll do a hybrid model, everybody. We'll if you've just got a question, put it in the text for the sake of time. But if you would like to unmute yourself and share, then I did see someone put their hand up using the Zoom hand up emoji. So why don't we, Hussein, can you let people unmute and they can just step in? And yeah, Stephanie, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi. Sorry, I was trying to turn my video on, but I see up at the video being turned off. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm doing some research on this myself right now. I'm a prof at the Augustana campus at U of A. I'm doing readings of Rita Wong's poetry and ecological grief. So I thank you so much for your research. I'm also from Newfoundland, from Stephenville. So I also love hearing about the work in Labrador that you're doing. Very distressing, but it's great to hear how you're doing it with the community and what their concerns are. So my question is about that affective kind of reciprocal feeling of grief as a set of relations. And I'm wondering, I think about the burden of who's involved in that grief community and how we might be able to mobilize affect to bring the people in charge into that space of grief. I recognize that people might be working for corporations or governing bodies or the settler colonial state and might have complicated feelings. I mean, even people who work in the oil sands might also be from, the First Nations that are around them. So, but I'm wondering, especially for people in power, is it just about political will, or is there a way? How is that will connected to kind of bringing people into that grief community in ways that, like, whether they're denying those feelings or letting money speak instead of the feelings? Like, is there a way to mobilize that so we can bring the people in who have the power to make some of those decisions? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for being here. And I love Rita's work as well. Big fan of her poetry and all that she does, and all of her intellectual and just giant humanity contributions. What you bring up is something that I think about all the time. And one of the experiences that I have really regularly, because I try to do a lot of work with policymakers and kind of, people are really interested in this. And so we'll have the formal meeting and, everyone talks and we talk about the research and the data. And then afterwards, people will generally approach me and say, I feel this in my personal life, but I can't bring it into my professional life. Or, I'm really worried about my grandchildren and I'm really scared about the impacts, but I can't talk about this, when I do X job. And I think that is something that so many of us have been forced into compartmentalizing what we may feel personally versus what we feel we can talk about professionally or what's acceptable professionally. And I think some of it is because, mental health as a whole is still so stigmatized in public conversation. And then you talk about climate change and mental health, and then you get to ecological grief. And so many people carry like an unneeded but totally understandable shame around feeling these emotions and feel silly or, and we've been taught in Western society that like humans are separate from the environment. So we only grieve human life. And if you feel bad about animal life, like there's something wrong with you, that's unless it's a pet. We're allowed to grieve pets. We've figured that part out, but only some pets. Other pets we seem to be, less caring about. So, I think part of it is we've had this like wide scale settler or colonial lens applied that has separated us out. And I think a lot of it is creating space in all different professional areas where we can actually have those discussions, and that they're understood to be as valid a form of data or as valid a form of experience as other forms of data and experience we use to make decisions. And that if people don't feel ready to make decisions based on that, to make decisions understanding that ecological grief and loss are only anticipated to increase, and that the mental health burdens of climate change are only anticipating to increase. So even if we're not ready to make decisions based on our own understanding, to take a lens that has a climate trauma approach becomes really important. But I think so much of it is the conversation too, is the more and more people are able to talk about it and share and find ways to bring it in and find ways to actually give concrete data that shows that this is a wide scale, impact that people are experiencing, I think is where we need to go. So I'm a big proponent, obviously, as a researcher, for more research, but I also worry because research is slow and takes time, and people's lived experience have far outstripped what we actually know in the literature. So somehow we have to kind of speed that up and bring both the lived experience and the political mobilization together with the data, and have those conversations and not be afraid of being able to speak about it in places and where it's appropriate. It's not always, we don't always have the position or the power to say certain things in certain spaces, but to find those opportunities that we do have available to us.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your experience and your question here, Stephanie. We will move over to a question from the chat, actually, that is very relevant to me as well. So Lindsay asks, I have been learning more about environmental anxiety and grief among children. Do you have any thoughts on how we can approach this idea of grief as a gift with children? And it's relevant for me because I have a little brother who's 9 turning 10. So I'm very aware that very soon he's going to start understanding these concepts and being exposed to them.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, Lindsay. I have a son who's going to be 18 shortly, and then one who's 12 and a half. And both of them have grown up with me in rigolette and doing this work. And what I didn't realize, and one of kind of the guilts that I carry as a mother, is because they were so exposed and I was always talking about my work and they were so embedded, they actually from a very young age internalized, climate grief and anxiety. And I didn't realize the extent to which that was happening. And so, I think it's key. This is a huge topic. There are many, many people doing extraordinary work with children and how to talk about children, or how to talk about climate change and climate grief with children. Caroline Hickman is doing excellent work out of the UK, but she also has training programs to talk, like, for people to learn how to talk to children about this. And part of it is the general ways that we tend to avoid talking about grief in general with children. Like, we're just particular cultures and like a Western approach, and is not great at talking about grief at all, and not preparing people for loss and how to understand it and how to build resilience ahead of time before you experience the loss. And now when we add on the layers of ecological grief and the climate change and the fear and anxiety, we're not doing a good job of that. Sarah Payton down in the US does some really important work about how to talk to children. And Sarah Jackert Ray also down in the United States. And I might have to send it to Justice. There's a wonderful book, and it's written for children like 6 to 14 years old around talking about climate emotions. And I'm forgetting the author. I can see the cover. If it comes out, I'll drop it in the chat. Otherwise, I'll send it out after, and maybe Justice could circulate it. But there are some really important things. And I find actually having those type of books where you can sit down and read them together, at least with my own kids, was really important to being able to talk through and actually work through things together and talk about like what loss means and how we can prepare for it, and how, there are natural cycles to life, and we can actually celebrate loss because we love something, and looking at both those, but building those skills ahead of time. And not being afraid to talk to kids and they know way more all the time, obviously, than we do. And they pick these things up. And it's such a key conversation I know kids are having with other kids. And we need to be a part of that too, and all learn from each other.
Thanks, Ashlee. That's a very amazing response. And yes, maybe what we can do, you're sharing a lot of amazing resources. Maybe I'll try to connect with you afterwards. I can get some of these, and then if anybody's interested, I'll put my email in the chat and you can get in touch with me, and then I will share these as well. Yeah, so Kristen, actually building off that in the chat, says, thank you, Ashlee. I'm so grateful for your work. I use it in my critical thinking and ethics course. Sorry, Kristen or Christine, I'm not sure. I apologize if I mispronounced that. But anyways, they share, one thing I heard this year for the first time is a reluctance to read poetry, including longs, which they use in their teaching, because it's too emotionally difficult to do so. In other words, a few students shut down because they don't know how to handle the pain and facing the truth of ecological destruction. So have you noticed anything like this yourself? And do you have any thoughts on how to handle that overwhelming, shut down instinct or impulse?
Yeah, I have definitely noticed it, and I've definitely experienced it myself too. And so, there's a really amazing quote from Aldo Leopold where he said, an environmental education is like living alone in a world of wounds. And the more that I find that I know, the more that I've worked with students, the more you're surrounded by, like, people get into these types of fields because they love it so much, because they care so much about the environment, because they love animals, because they love the water, whatever it is that drives you into an environmental related field is because you are connected and you're passionate. So then when we now bring in, cohorts of students or people are doing research, and instead of it being, let's look at the coral reefs and talk about them, and we can visit them and they'll be there for decades. Now we're saying, okay, well, now they're almost gone. There's going to be bleaching. You may never see them. And we're saying this with everything. So we're teaching people during a time of loss, and we're teaching people to anticipate loss. And that incredible amount of burden and pain that comes with that environmental education. So not only do we love it, but now we have to face its loss. And we often then also have to face feeling helpless within that. And so I have noticed many, many students talking more about this, like, I don't know if I can continue. I need a break. I need to step away. This is too painful. And I think it's not just students. I think it's many, many of us working in the field. Thoughts on how to handle it? I think people need to be supported to step away, but I also think they need to be supported in the classroom. And there are moves. There's lots of people trying to figure out how we do this type of work in the classroom, and what we can do. But I think supporting students actually in the curriculum and having these discussions. So it's really exciting to see so many of you on the call are teaching this and are talking about it, because then that starts to, yes, Madison, All the Feelings Under the Sun. Thank you very much. That's the one I was going for. That's a great book to have a discussion, but also to talk about with your students at an age appropriate level. And I think having these things where it's built into the curriculum and where we actually talk about it and we embrace it and we connect it with the other types of curriculum that we're doing.
Absolutely. This is very relevant to the work our office does as well. And yeah, it's amazing to have so many educators on the call. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. I see two folks have their hands up. So David, I saw your hand went up just a little bit before Hannah's. So we'll let you go first, and then Hannah, you'll be right afterwards.
Yeah, so I've been teaching a course on climate emotions and systems change this year in the political science department, a couple of courses actually. And one thing I'd say, just in pitching into that previous bit of conversation, is insofar as it's a highly participatory classroom, the students are good at supporting one another. And so I think as long as this is individualized and treated as an individual quirk, then yes, it can be very isolating and painful. And I think that students have more tools than they might have when I was coming up to be genuine supports to one another through this. I guess one of the things that, I was teaching this through pandemic and also teaching it in Alberta, and in ways we could go into more, each of those has been a canvas on which we can see tremendous pathological dissociation at the political level. We are just so relentlessly not connecting to the reality of what is happening, that it's breathtaking. And so, just to take the pandemic example, emotion is talked about, including by those with great political power, in terms of anxiety, in terms of something very individualized, in terms of something we should be kind to one another about and take care of one another with. But what just twists one's mind is the extent to which that language of the therapeutic, that language of the emotional, coexists with with decisions and behaviors that are so out of joint and so out of touch with the realities that we are encountering. And so I think that in some of the climate emotions literature, there is this optimism that the more people can connect with this felt level and embodied level of experience, the more it will help to support political change. And yet, I guess from my perspective, the distance between those is so vast that actually the healthy aspect of grappling with climate emotions is coming to terms with how little we are doing in the face that something that is relentless and time constrained. So I'd love to hear anything that provokes in you. The one other thing I will mention, this is another way that my students came into touch with your voice, is through The Magnitude of All Things, which is just a beautiful documentary that's available, I'll say, through the University of Alberta library. And so I really commend that very highly. It's a very deep exploration of climate emotion. So thanks for being here. I'd love to hear a bit from you.
Well, thank you, David, for being here and for sharing all of that. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And thank you for the plug on The Magnitude of All Things. I think the work that Jennifer Abbott did through that film was remarkable, and linking planetary grief to personal grief and pushing those conversations, I think is so relevant to what you were just talking about. That personal and planetary, the personal and the political. On good days, I do feel a bit of hopeful optimism that if we come together in our sorrow, we can make a difference. On bad days, which is probably most days, I totally agree with you that maybe right now the healthiest thing we can do is actually come to terms with it and face it, and that might actually be the way that we can start to make change. I think the pandemic showed us that we can, quote unquote, pivot, because that was the term of the time, incredibly quickly. But now we're seeing very overt intersections of power and privilege and continued government decisions. I don't know if anyone saw the announcement in Newfoundland that we are going forward with major oil and gas development in the Bay du Nord field. So our province is taking a green oil, like we got this sort of approach, which is very difficult for many people. And I think that we're the disassociation that you mentioned is so key, because how do we keep living as disassociated beings? But if we did bring our whole selves to it, I mean, there's this Joe Confina wrote about this back in 2014. He said, if we truly understood what was happening, we would all be curled up and doubled over in pain in the fetal position, and we couldn't function. Like, if we truly let the climate crisis in and all that it means, and the human loss and the more than human loss, like, how would we cope? So there is this kind of like denial, disassociation piece that's needed to move forward and to actually get up and move. But then too much allows us to continue the behaviors that we're seeing now. And I totally agree that we're seeing this strange mobilization of therapeutic language, as you call, by people in political positions of power, corporate, saying, take care. Or well done, or take a mental health break, or what we're seeing here actually in Labrador that people are really fighting against is, governments and corporations praising Inuit for their resilience and saying, good for you, you're surviving, like you're an example to everyone else, rather than saying, like, we're not taking any responsibility for the systems of power and privilege and oppression that led to this point. That's another form of colonization. Instead, it's praising people for making it through painful situations that were caused by others. So we're not taking responsibility. And I don't know, this occupies a lot of my very early morning thoughts. I'm a early morning riser, and sadly, this is one of the things I think about all the time, is what do we do? Like, how do we have these conversations that are in ways that make change? And I have noticed a huge shift since we can talk about grief and loss and people are coming together around it. But it's how do we get it up to the next levels that actually make systemic change? And I think, the conversation that Stephanie brought up about how do we bridge all of these different areas, like how do we actually start going beyond, like, so we collect, and then how do we transform? Like, what do we do? So if anyone has any great suggestions, you might save me some, 5 a.m. churning as I wake up. But yeah, it's the questions of our time. Like, I really believe we're at this kind of intense existential crisis point around how do we embrace grief and loss and all that it means within power and privilege and climate change. So thank you for bringing that in, and thank you for sharing all that you've been doing with your students.
Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Ashlee, for your thoughtful response. Hannah, I see your hand up.
Hi, Hannah. I get to work with Hannah and Madison Cooper, who put in the resource. So these are two really amazing students at U of A I get to work with. So nice to see you.
Yes, that was an amazing talk. Thank you so much. So I'm been new to this kind of sphere of climate grief and climate anxiety, and it's always been something I think that I have noticed as important, but being able to put the words to it lately, kind of in the past 6 months, has really helped me personally to kind of cope with these feelings and with like all that it brings. And I guess my question and kind of like comment is, so not a lot of my friends and not a lot of my peers are science people. Most of my friends and my peers are very much they're a big fan of like fine arts, a little bit more on kind of the sides of things that don't necessarily touch on climate change within their courses. And I noticed this as well online with people who maybe, aren't necessarily post-secondary students, but are my age. And what I noticed from a lot of my peers and just kind of other people my age is this like nihilism that like there's no point in doing anything because the world is so bad. And I struggle with that so much. And my little sister is in high school, and she struggles with this, and her friends struggle with this, in that why would we do anything when the grown-ups aren't listening? And I mean, I am a grown-up technically, but I don't know if I really quite feel like one yet. And so when I kind of have these conversations with other people, and when I kind of focus on this, I don't know what to tell them when they tell me that it's useless, because I don't think it's useless. And I want to try to take this like optimistic stance, but it is really challenging. So like when we're talking to people who maybe environmentalism isn't their thing, how do we do that in a way that's going to be productive and that's going to bring forward maybe a little bit less of like the screw it attitude?
Well, Hannah, I think that sounds like a great master's project research. So I know you're looking for that, but I think that I think it's a critical question, and it's something I hear all the time too, and all different ages. Also, a lot of adults, and actually a lot of colleagues, and people who are scientists and researchers in this area too are starting to hit this sort of nihilistic point as well, thinking like, what do we do? I think one of I have the privilege of working with a number of therapists and psychologists who do this work, and one of the things they always talk about is sort of validating the feelings and then looking to elevate them. And so finding out like, why do we feel nihilistic, and then talking through it and actually having conversations about it. Like, is it that it's so overwhelming? Is it you don't know where to start? Is it you've tried and something hasn't worked? Have you experienced something directly? Like, kind of getting to it and then finding ways to continue to have those conversations. And I think it is that the collective discussion. And like David said, the students coming together, supporting each other in class, finding ways to have it. And I often find in my own experience, if I feel that nihilism, it's because of something else. Like nihilism isn't the base point for me. It's a response to something else. It might be because I'm burnt out from it, or something, terrible happened, or I, just consumed way too much traumatic climate change media all at once. And, so the the nihilism is the response, but it's not the core. And I think that's why when in my younger days, I let anger drive me a lot. Like I was like, really into the protesting and the angry things and chaining myself to trees and, having direct action. But I was always so burnt out from it. And Judith Butler calls it the dry heaving of endless political rage. And that so resonates to even where I feel. And that if I let anger be the driving point for me, I end up in nihilism. And this is just me personally. I'm speaking kind of where I am. And so I find actually that if I can tap into the grief and the loss, what you're tapping into is also the love and the strength and the reciprocal relationships. And for some reason, for me and for others that I've talked to and things that we're seeing in research, this is actually a place that is painful, but more sustainable and actually can inspire more movement and change. If we can attend to it. Like we can't just leave it alone. We can't suffer in silence. We can't let it turn into maladaptive things where it actually physically means, we're struggling and we can't work or study or those things. But there is this kind of opportunity with grief where we can move through. And so, when I feel nihilistic, I try to tap into other things. When I talk to people around this, it's having that discussion, like what is actually under there and what can we do? But I also do think nihilism makes total sense, because just like grief makes total sense, like these emotions that we're having, we are in unprecedented times of cascading loss and grief. And if we don't have a whole complex set of emotions around that, something's wrong. Like that's actually where I think the maladaptive piece is, if we don't feel a whole variety of things that are overwhelming, because we should be, and maybe we even need more grief and loss and anger and maybe not so much nihilism because that promotes not great behaviors, but, like maybe we need more emotions and allow ourselves to feel more. But it's, I think you would be a wonderful researcher for that question.
Definitely on the table. Thank you so much, Ashlee. That was a wonderful answer.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Ashlee. Kate, I see your question/comment. It seems like maybe Ashlee just kind of touched on that sort of coincidentally. So what I'll do is, okay, perfect. Thanks. We have a couple of minutes left here. So if anybody has one last question, we should have time. But in the meantime, Ashlee, maybe I'll just ask you one of mine because it kind of builds off yours, and I'll exercise my moderator privileges here a little bit because I'm very interested in it. You talked about, well, obviously a lot about grief and the need to tap into this sort of I guess the ways that grief can be healing once you move through it. And I'm wondering, because it's sort of we're at this intersection of, we all have this individual grief and this community level grief at different levels, but there is also the need for the institutional sort of bureaucratic system to move forward. And that to me, from outside is sort of where the public health idea comes in. Public health is the field that can talk about some of these things. And I'm wondering, are you aware of any other examples where this idea of grief, maybe not in terms of climate, but in terms of other ways, has been discussed or has been, has I guess have there been conversations in which grief has been something that has moved policy change? Is there precedence for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. If only systems could grieve, that would be such an amazing change. I think that not necessarily direct policy, but I can see it affecting more and more the discussions that those who make policy are starting to consider. And that's a huge first step. And I think that more and more of those who are creating policy themselves are experiencing this. I'm seeing it a lot with colleagues like in Environment and Climate Change Canada. This is a huge topic that their staff is grappling with. You're seeing sort of people really shifting how we look at these things. I think in the legal realm, there's some interesting things, and I'm not going to say it's motivated by grief, but like when we're seeing movements for like giving legal personhood in quotations to things like rivers and bodies of water, and like that is to give rights and sovereignty to more than human beings to allow them to then be saved, in quotations, even though they're sovereign beings. And people aren't explicitly linking that to grief, but it's explicitly linking it to not want more loss or development. So I think we're seeing shifts there. I think more discussions Health Canada in their national assessment has for the first time a whole chapter on mental health impacts, which is a huge shift. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the AR6 report, which Dr. Sherry Lee Harper is a lead author on many of those chapters, and I was a collaborating author with her. We put ecological grief in, and for the first time, there was enough data for IPCC reports as a whole to assess climate change and mental health, because there's been such a jump in understanding in literature since the last one. So we're seeing that type of change, like it's working into all the narratives. But in terms of like how we're creating climate policies, I'm not seeing it. But if anyone has any examples, I would love to know. But I think we're getting close. Like I think we're getting to the point now where people are starting to think about how much, what a climate informed traumatic grief lens would look like if we took to policy. So again, if anyone knows of examples, I would love to send me an email, put it in the chat. I would love to know.
Thanks so much for your really thoughtful response there, Ashlee. It sounds like maybe we are moving towards systems that can grieve and not just be greedy, and the bad, the healing parts of the human experience, not just the really bad egocentric ones. Okay, well, we're right at 1 now. So if it's okay with you, we'll just close off. Rachel asked this question, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. Rachel asked, they've always wondered what makes people care about the environment and some not. They've explored this with children, and childhood feelings and experiences seem to be a part of it. And they're wondering if you have any ways to get people to basically care more and be connected more to the environment and want to protect it. And I'll paraphrase to say, maybe, do you have any final thoughts, any takeaways for our audience today, how we can help ourselves and our communities connect to this process and to the environment around us?
Yeah, and I think I'll answer kind of both together. I think, getting like time in nature and connecting in place. I know that sounds trite, but it is absolutely essential. If we don't have connection to place and we don't find the awe in the environment and we're not moved, we're not going to be moved to make change or to work hard to save what can be saved and to mourn what has been lost. So I think that connection, there's a really wonderful where Naomi Klein was in conversation with Wendell Berry when she released her book, and she said, what do we do about the climate crisis? And he said, stop and find a place and start the 1,000-year process of getting to know a place. So that deep connection that we carry with generations, and knowing that it's not just us, we're not just isolated, that there are people who came before and people who will come later. So finding that connection, that awe, and not being alone, like knowing that our sorrow is totally rational, totally reasonable, makes perfect sense. And we have to talk about it more, and we have to support each other and come together in that community, and then push for systems to change and find ways that we can, all of us have avenues we can make change. And if we all find those mechanisms, that we can move forward and taking care of ourselves while we do it. So don't ignore the grief, find ways to talk about it. And so that you're nourished in the pain as you move forward for your own personal action.
Thank you so much, Ashlee. Those are wonderful closing thoughts. And thank you again so much. We're honored to have you here today. And thank you all for attending. This was, as Michaela just said, a conversation that is very timely and needed. So thank you all.
Yes, thank everyone for being here. It's such an honor to have these conversations and to know that there are so many people out there doing this important work. I feel really in solidarity with everyone here today, and thank you for all that you do. And Justice, thank you to you and Hussein and the organizers, and for excellent moderation and Q&A today. Really appreciated.
Thank you very much.